In the spring of 1945, a young woman named Anna stood in line at an American processing center in Cherbourg, France. Her Wehrmacht auxiliary uniform hung loose on her frame, the gray-green wool stiff with weeks of unwashed sweat and fear. She had been told since childhood that Americans were savage, that capture meant degradation, perhaps worse. She had steeled herself for brutality. What she got instead was soap, real soap, white, heavy, fragrant, and hot water. Clean towels, fresh clothing. Anna would later write in her contraband diary, "They gave us dignity when we expected only shame." How does one reconcile this? She wasn't alone in her confusion. Over 500,000 German women served in uniformed Wehrmacht auxiliary roles during World War II, manning anti-aircraft guns, operating radios, typing orders in field headquarters. They weren't soldiers officially. The Reich had refused them that status, keeping them in legal limbo as army entourage. But when the war ended and thousands surrendered to American forces, they faced a reckoning more profound than any battle. This is the story of what happened when ideology collided with reality. When women raised on propaganda about American barbarism encountered instead abundance, civility, and the Geneva Convention. When the enemy proved more humane than the Reich itself. It's a story about how the most devastating weapon wasn't bombs or bullets, but something far simpler: unexpected kindness. Because hatred is easy, dignity is unbearable. The journey to American POW camps began years earlier in the youth halls and training centers across Nazi Germany. By 1941, with the Eastern Front devouring men by the hundreds of thousands, the Wehrmacht faced a crisis. Who would man the radios? The switchboards? The searchlights? The answer came wrapped in careful ideology. Women could serve, but they would be helpers, not soldiers. Wehrmacht-Helferinnen. The distinction mattered enormously to Nazi leadership. Women warriors violated the regime's vision of femininity, but women supporting warriors, that was different. From the League of German Girls, the female branch of Hitler Youth, came the first wave of volunteers. They were told they were freeing men for combat, that their service was temporary, auxiliary, feminine in its essence. Half volunteered willingly in those early years, drawn by adventure, by duty, by the intoxicating pull of belonging to something larger than themselves. Greta from Hamburg signed up at 17 to operate anti-aircraft searchlights. She had watched her brothers march off to war and wanted her own uniform, her own purpose. Ilse from Munich became a signals operator, her fingers flying across telegraph keys, translating battlefield chaos into orderly messages. Margaret served as a secretary in an SS administrative office, filing papers and typing reports, never asking what the reports contained. By war's end, the numbers were staggering. More than 500,000 women in Wehrmacht auxiliaries. Another 160,000 as flak gun auxiliaries, their searchlights scanning night skies for Allied bombers. 10,000 in the SS Helferinnen Corps, 500,000 more in civil aerial defense. They wore uniforms but had no military status. They faced danger but could not be decorated as soldiers. They were essential to the war machine but legally invisible. The work was real enough. Radio operators listened to frontline chaos, their headsets crackling with death. Searchlight operators stood exposed on rooftops while bombs fell around them. Field nurses held together boys blown apart by artillery. Secretaries typed orders that sent men to their deaths. And through it all, they were told the Allies were monsters, especially the Americans. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as cultural degenerates who would show no mercy to captured Germans. The Morgenthau Plan, calling for Germany's deindustrialization, was presented as proof of genocidal intent. Women were warned specifically that capture by Americans meant degradation, rape, possibly execution. The term used in whispered conversations was, "wolves, not men." As the Reich collapsed in early 1945, female auxiliaries faced a desperate choice. The Red Army was approaching from the east, and its reputation was even more terrifying. Soviet forces were already perpetrating mass rape across occupied German territory. Estimates would later suggest up to 2 million German women and girls suffered sexual violence at Soviet hands. So they fled west, across bombed highways, through shattered cities, pushing handcarts loaded with whatever they could salvage. They walked for days, for weeks, sleeping in ditches and abandoned barns. Their uniforms marked them as military, making them targets for both vengeful civilians and advancing armies. Better to surrender to Americans than Soviets. That calculation drove thousands of women on the final desperate trek westward. But terror traveled with them. They expected to be made examples of, brutalized by the victors. The moments of capture varied. Some auxiliaries were rounded up in the final chaotic weeks as Allied forces overran German positions. Others, like the nurses captured near Cherbourg in July 1944, had months in captivity before war's end. Processing centers sprang up in occupied ports, Bremen, Le Havre, Cherbourg. Here, in the shadow of ships flying American flags, the women lined up for registration. Names recorded, possessions catalogued, numbers assigned. They waited for the blow that never came. American soldiers looked at them with curiosity, sometimes with coldness, but rarely with the savage hatred they'd been promised. The processing was bureaucratic, almost boring. Forms, stamps, directives. The Geneva Convention of 1929 was clear. Prisoners of war are entitled to respect for their persons and honor. Women shall be treated with all consideration due to their sex. But the women didn't know this. They knew only what they'd been told, that surrender meant the end of dignity. The ambiguity of their legal status created complications. Were they POWs? They wore uniforms and served military functions, but Germany had denied them military status. Some, particularly those in signals intelligence, required investigation. Others, especially SS Helferinnen, faced automatic detention for denazification. But the Americans, navigating carefully, chose to treat them as prisoners of war under Geneva Convention standards. It was a choice that would prove more devastating to Nazi ideology than any bombing campaign. The ships were military transports, their holds modified to carry human cargo across the Atlantic. Steel bunks stacked 3 high, narrow walkways between, the smell of diesel and salt water. Seasickness swept through the women in waves, their bodies unused to the ocean's constant motion. But then came breakfast. Trays appeared carried by American servicemen who moved with practiced efficiency. On those trays, bread, real bread, white, soft, still warm, slabs of meat, coffee with cream, eggs scrambled with butter. The women stared. In the final years of war, German civilian rations had dropped to 1,412 calories per day. Bread, when available, was Ersatzbrot, sawdust mixed with barley and potato flour. It sat in the stomach like cement. The women had grown accustomed to hunger as a constant companion, gnawing at concentration, stealing warmth from the body. Now, aboard enemy ships, they were being offered more food in one meal than many had seen in weeks. Some refused to eat. It had to be drugged. A trick. Why else would the Americans waste such abundance on prisoners? Others, too hungry to resist, ate and wept. The taste of real bread, the shock of meat dissolving on the tongue, coffee that actually warmed instead of just staining the water brown, it was too much. One woman clutched her slice of bread and sobbed into it, unable to reconcile this with everything she'd been taught. The voyage lasted days. With each meal, with each day that passed without cruelty, the women's expectations began to crack. They talked in low voices in their bunks at night, sharing confusion like contraband. Why do they feed us like this? Are they fattening us for worse treatment later? Perhaps they're different from what we were told. That last whisper was treason, and everyone knew it. But the thought wouldn't go away. The skyline rose from the ocean like something from another world. New York, Boston, New Orleans. Whichever port received them, the sight was the same. Towers of steel and glass, untouched by war. The women crowded the rails, staring in disbelief. Every German city they knew was rubble. Munich, Hamburg, Berlin, all had been bombed into skeletal remains. Children lived in cellars, families huddled in half-collapsed buildings. Here stood America, gleaming and whole. The Statue of Liberty drew no smiles. For women who'd been taught America was their mortal enemy, the symbol felt like mockery. Yet as they disembarked, the contradiction deepened. Crowds gathered at the piers, but the jeering they expected was muted. Most Americans simply watched with curiosity. These were the enemy? These thin, exhausted women in threadbare uniforms? The processing stations on American soil moved with mechanical efficiency. More forms, more stamps. Then buses, olive drab and rumbling, that would carry them inland to camps scattered across the United States. Through the windows, America unfolded. Green fields untouched by shell craters, towns with white churches and tidy homes, children on bicycles, women pushing strollers, shops with their windows intact, displaying goods the German women couldn't even name anymore. One prisoner from Cologne pressed her forehead to the glass and whispered, "It's like they're living on another planet." 700 camps dotted the American landscape, holding 425,000 German POWs by war's end. The camps in the South drew many of the women: Fort Oglethorpe in Georgia, Camp Ruston in Louisiana, Fort Benning, Camp Stewart, Camp Wheeler. As the buses rolled through camp gates, the women saw barbed wire, guard towers, sentries with rifles. This at least matched their expectations. But the barracks themselves were strange. Wooden buildings with electric lights, flush toilets, hot showers, steam heat. The buildings alone contained more lumber than entire German villages now possessed. They were formed into lines and marched toward what would become the defining moment of their captivity. A building with steam rising from its vents. The delousing station. Hearts pounded. This was it. The humiliation they'd been warned about. They would be stripped, mocked, degraded. Some clutched rosaries. Others simply went numb, retreating into themselves. The line moved forward. One by one they entered, and found themselves handed bars of soap. Real soap. White, heavy, smelling faintly of flowers. Not the gray caustic blocks they'd known in Germany. Not the synthetic substitutes that dissolved into slime. Real soap that lathered, that cleaned, that smelled like something other than war. Then hot water. Showers that actually worked, that poured clean water hot enough to sting, long enough to wash away weeks of grime and fear. Clean towels followed, fresh garments. The women stood under those showers and wept, not from pain, from the shattering realization that the enemy had given them something their own nation had stolen years ago: basic human dignity. Anna, gripping the soap so hard her knuckles whitened, whispered to no one in particular, "What world is this?" That night, lying in bunks with hair still damp, wrapped in blankets that smelled of starch and cotton, the women couldn't sleep. They whispered questions into the darkness. If the enemy could show such humanity in this small thing, what else had the Reich lied about? The answer to that question would unfold in the weeks and months to come. One meal, one kindness, one shattering revelation at a time. Morning came with a bell, not with bombs. The women woke to light streaming through windows, not to air raid sirens. They filed to the mess hall, and what awaited them there defied every assumption they'd carried across the Atlantic. Breakfast, cereal with milk, toast with jam, scrambled eggs, bacon, coffee with real cream. German POWs received over 3,000 calories per day. By comparison, German civilians in 1945 were subsisting on fewer than 1,412 calories. The women did the mathematics in their heads and felt sick. Lunch brought meat with vegetables, potatoes or rice, bread and dessert. Dinner offered more of the same. On Sundays, chicken or turkey appeared, cooked American style with sides the women had never encountered. And then came Christmas 1945. The mess hall was decorated with paper chains and pine boughs. The tables groaned under the weight of the feast. Roast turkey, honey-glazed ham, mashed potatoes, candied sweet potatoes, green beans, corn, cranberry sauce, fresh rolls. And for dessert, 3 types of pie: mince, pumpkin, and apple, served with vanilla ice cream. Women who had watched family members starve now sat before abundance that seemed obscene. Some couldn't eat. Others ate and hated themselves for enjoying it. A few wrote letters home describing the meal, then tore them up, unable to send such words to mothers boiling weeds for soup. Work assignments came next. Light duties, nothing brutal. Kitchen work, laundry, field harvesting. The women were paid wages in camp scrip, currency that could be spent at the camp canteen. The canteen became the site of daily miracles. On its shelves, Hershey bars, cigarettes, pencils, lipstick, in a POW camp. A woman from Bremen stood before the display for 10 minutes, unable to process it. She had watched her city burn under Allied bombs. Her younger sister had died in the rubble, and here in captivity, the enemy offered her cosmetics. She bought the lipstick, applied it in a cracked mirror, stared at her reflection, and couldn't recognize the woman looking back. The camp hospital was better equipped than most German civilian hospitals had been since 1941. X-ray machines, surgical equipment, pharmaceutical supplies that were pure fantasy in bombed German cities, and penicillin. The Americans used penicillin freely, even for minor infections. German soldiers were dying from lack of basic sulfa drugs. German children suffered infections that would heal with simple antibiotics. Yet here, POWs received cutting-edge medicine without question. The physical transformation was inevitable. Bodies that had survived on starvation rations began to heal. Cheeks filled out. Hair regained its luster. Skin cleared. The women looked younger, healthier, more alive than they had in years. This transformation was perhaps the cruelest gift of all. Each pound gained, each return of color to the face, served as living proof that their own nation had been slowly killing them, while the enemy restored them to health. Anna noted in her diary, "I am gaining weight in captivity. My mother writes that she weighs 40 kilos now, her bones visible through her skin. How do I tell her I ate turkey yesterday?" The mirrors in the camp washrooms became instruments of torture. To see oneself healthy while families starved created a psychological wound no Geneva Convention could address. Letters from home arrived irregularly, passing through military censors. They carried news that hollowed out whatever peace the women might have found. A mother in Munich. "We live in the cellar. The apartment above is gone. Frida found a rat yesterday. We ate it." A sister in Hamburg. "The children have not had milk in 2 months. Klaus coughs blood. There is no medicine." A friend in Berlin. "They say the Soviets are worse than death." Anna K. shot herself rather than face them. I think she was wise. The women read these letters and looked at their own trays of food with something approaching horror. The shame of plenty became a weight heavier than chains. Night brought no relief. In the darkness of the barracks, women lay awake wrestling with questions that had no answers. If the Americans were the savage enemy they'd been taught about, why this treatment? If the Reich truly cared for its people, why had it left them to starve while sending its women to staff war offices? Some held tight to their beliefs. These guards were anomalies, they insisted. The real America was still the monster of propaganda. This kindness was temporary, a trick. Any day now the mask would slip. But days became weeks, weeks became months, and the mask never slipped. Others began to crack under the cognitive dissonance. One woman had a breakdown in the mess hall, screaming at her plate, "Why are you feeding me? Why aren't you punishing me?" The guards led her gently away to the hospital. She was given sedatives and counseling. Even kindness felt like punishment. Work details took women outside the camps under armed escort. They harvested crops, worked in canneries, cleaned public parks. And there, the contradictions deepened. American towns flowed with normal life. Cinemas advertised new films. Grocery stores displayed shelves bursting with goods. Radios played jazz and baseball games. Children chased each other on sidewalks. Women in dresses chatted outside churches. The German women worked in silence, their eyes drinking in scenes that seemed pulled from dreams. This was the enemy? This abundance? This normality? This casual peace? One day, a work detail was given lunch at a church hall by local volunteers. Farm wives mostly, who'd prepared sandwiches, fruit, and pies. They set the food before the German prisoners with a mixture of curiosity and Christian charity. An elderly woman with flour on her apron urged them, "Eat, eat. You're too thin." Anna bit into an apple and nearly collapsed. She hadn't tasted fresh fruit since 1942. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, and she heard her mother's voice from memory. "Save the peel for soup." Across the table, another prisoner whispered, "This is paradise." But Anna couldn't speak. She could only chew the apple slowly, mechanically, as tears rolled down her face. Not all encounters were kind. Some Americans spat insults, others glared with naked grief, having lost sons or brothers in Europe. But even the hostility was restrained. No beatings, no humiliations. The Americans seemed to operate under rules the Reich had abandoned long ago. The women noticed other things too. Black soldiers among the guards, women in military uniforms. A social order that didn't match Nazi teachings about racial hierarchy. Everything about America challenged the worldview they'd been raised with. And perhaps most devastating of all, the ordinary kindness of ordinary Americans. A guard sharing a cigarette, a farmer's wife offering a second sandwich, a child waving from a car window. These small gestures accumulated like water eroding stone. What hatred couldn't do, humanity accomplished. The fortress of ideology began to crumble. As 1945 turned to 1946, American authorities faced a question. What to do with hundreds of thousands of German POWs, including the female auxiliaries? The answer was denazification, a systematic attempt to purge Nazi influence from German society. Every prisoner had to be processed, categorized, judged. For the women, this meant questionnaires, detailed probing documents that asked about political biography, party membership, organizational affiliations. The forms were translated into German, typed on American paper, and distributed through the camps. The women bent over these forms in mess halls and barracks, pencils trembling in their hands. How to answer? What would happen based on their responses? The classification system had 5 categories. 1. Major offenders, those who bore significant responsibility for Nazi crimes. 2. Offenders, active supporters who benefited from the regime. 3. Lesser offenders, those who participated but bore less responsibility. 4. Followers, nominal participants. 5. Exonerated, those who could prove they resisted or bore no responsibility. The SS Helferinnen faced automatic detention and investigation. Their voluntary participation in SS bureaucracy made them particularly suspect. Some had worked in administrative offices connected to concentration camps. They had typed reports, filed documents, maintained records of the Holocaust's machinery. When confronted with evidence of what those offices had done, many claimed ignorance. I only typed what I was told. I didn't know what the papers meant. I was just following orders. The Americans were not always sympathetic. War crimes trials loomed for some. A few women, very young, would be condemned to death and hanged for their roles in concentration camp atrocities. Their age bought them no mercy. For most, though, classification fell into Category 4, followers. They had participated in the Nazi system but without command responsibility. They would face fines, forced retirement from certain professions, or confinement to labor camps. The process revealed the moral complexity of the situation. These were not simple victims or perpetrators. They were women who had made choices within a totalitarian system, choices that ranged from active collaboration to passive compliance to desperate survival. Anna's questionnaire sat before her for 3 days before she could bring herself to fill it out. Secretary to a Wehrmacht field office. League of German Girls member since age 14. No party membership. No knowledge of specific war crimes. The truth, but also a lie. She hadn't known specifics true, but she had seen things. Rumors overheard, questions unasked, the willful blindness that kept the machinery running. She wrote the answers that would classify her as a follower and felt neither relieved nor guilty, only exhausted. As denazification proceeded, news from Germany painted an increasingly grim picture. The homeland they'd left in chaos had become something worse, a landscape of utter ruin. Letters described the reality: cities reduced to rubble fields where streets once ran. Children living in cellar holes, their lungs filled with dust. Families surviving on rations that barely kept souls in bodies. The elderly dying of cold because there was no fuel. Women working for occupation forces for survival. By December 1945, 300,000 Germans were employed by the U.S. military, including 100,000 women. They cleaned barracks, washed laundry, served in mess halls. In exchange, they received rations, a small wage, and access to PX stores where American goods appeared like visions from another world. But this employment came with its own stigma. Women who worked for Americans were labeled Ami Liebchen, Army Sweethearts, Schokoladenmädchen, Chocolate Girls, Veronika Dankeschön, a bitter pun referencing both gratitude and venereal disease. To survive was to be shamed. To starve was to maintain dignity. German women were trapped between these poles, judged harshly regardless of choice. The POWs in American camps knew this awaited them. As rumors of repatriation grew, dread filled the barracks. They would be sent back to rubble, to hunger, to families who might resent their healthy faces and well-fed bodies. "I am afraid to go back," one woman admitted in the darkness. Others nodded, silent. It was treasonous to prefer enemy captivity to homecoming, but the truth wouldn't be denied. Something fundamental had shifted in these women. They had left Germany as believers, however wavering, in the Reich's narrative. They returned changed in ways that went beyond physical health. Some transformations were small. A woman who learned to read English from American newspapers, another who discovered she liked jazz music, a third who befriended a blackguard and learned her entire worldview about race was propaganda. Other changes cut deeper. Women who had never questioned authority now questioned everything. They had seen with their own eyes that the enemy was not monstrous, that abundance existed while their nation starved, that the Geneva Convention meant something to Americans even when it might have been easier to ignore it. The greatest transformation was perhaps the most painful, the recognition that their own government had lied to them about fundamental realities. Not propaganda exaggerations, but complete inversions of truth. Anna wrestled with this in her diary entries. They said Americans were savages. But who are the savages now? The ones who bombed our homes? Or the ones who fed us while our families starved? The ones who started this war? Or the ones who treated prisoners according to rules even when rules might be inconvenient? She had no answers. Only questions that multiplied like fractals, each spawning new doubts. Some women resisted the transformation. They held tight to their beliefs, interpreting every kindness as manipulation, every act of humanity as strategy. For them, ideological purity was the last possession the enemy couldn't take. But for most, the fortress had fallen. They didn't become Americans or even pro-American. They simply lost certainty. And in a world built on propaganda's certainties, doubt was revolutionary. The contradictions piled up until they couldn't be ignored. Fed by the enemy while families starved, treated with dignity by supposed beasts, given medicine while comrades died, restored to health in captivity, made to feel human by those they'd been taught to hate. These contradictions didn't resolve into neat lessons. They remained messy, painful, irreducible. But they changed everything. Repatriation began in earnest in 1946. Ships that had carried POWs westward now carried them east. The women packed their few possessions, including items purchased at camp canteens, chocolate bars saved for family, soap, lipstick, cigarettes that could be traded for necessities. Some packed letters from American guards, small kindnesses written on paper. Good luck to you. I hope you find your family well. God bless you on your journey. The voyage back was somber. The abundance of the American ships was gone, replaced by basic transport. The women huddled together, facing an unknown that terrified them more than captivity had. They were healthy now, well-fed, clean. How would their families react? Would there be resentment? Would they be seen as collaborators because they'd eaten American food and followed American rules? More fundamentally, what world were they returning to? The German ports were barely recognizable. Cherbourg, Bremen, these places had been damaged when they'd left. Now they were thoroughly wrecked. Bombed buildings, skeletal cranes, rubble piled high. The smell of ash and decay hung in the air. From the ships, they could see what their homeland had become. A nation crushed absolutely. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted 12 years and left Germany in ruins that would take decades to clear. The women dispersed to their home cities, each journey revealing new devastation. Hamburg was a wasteland, Munich barely recognizable, Berlin divided and broken. Even small towns bore the marks of total war, windows blown out, roofs collapsed, streets cratered. Anna returned to Munich and found her family living in a cellar beneath what had been their apartment building. Her mother, once plump and rosy, was skeletal. Her younger brothers had hollow eyes and swollen bellies from malnutrition. They stared at Anna, healthy, round-faced, clean, as though she'd returned from the dead. "You're fat," her mother said. Not accusatory, just fact. Anna opened her bag and distributed the treasures she'd saved. Chocolate bars, soap, cigarettes. Her family fell on them like manna. Her mother clutched the soap and wept. Over thin soup that night, Anna tried to explain what had happened to her, how the Americans had treated them. The food, the medicine, the strange civility. Her brother, who'd fought on the Eastern Front and barely survived, cut her off. Don't tell me the enemy was kind. Don't make me think about that." She understood. To acknowledge American humanity required acknowledging German inhumanity. It meant confronting everything they'd done, everything they'd supported, everything they'd ignored. Some families never forgave. Daughters who'd eaten American food while brothers starved in POW camps in the East. Sisters who'd returned healthy while siblings died of typhus. The guilt didn't wash away with soap. Other women faced different challenges. Those who'd worked for the SS faced harsh judgment during denazification tribunals. Some were barred from professional work, others fined heavily, a few imprisoned or executed. But the majority simply faded back into the population. They married, found work, rebuilt lives in a Germany that wanted to forget. The question of individual responsibility was too painful for a shattered nation to fully confront. Persilschein certificates, whitewash documents, became common, sworn statements from friends and neighbors testifying to non-Nazi sympathies. The women who'd been POWs in America carried their experiences quietly. It was not something to boast about, not something to discuss. They had seen abundance while Germany starved. They had encountered enemy humanity while German cruelty echoed through concentration camp revelations. Some even found themselves defending Americans in conversations, then stopping, shocked at their own words. Decades later, historians would note the anomaly. German prisoners of war in American captivity were treated better than many Americans themselves during the Depression. They received more food than Allied civilians in liberated Europe. The Geneva Convention was followed not as propaganda, but as policy. This wasn't purely altruistic. America had the resources to spare. Following international law served strategic purposes. An American treatment of German POWs stood in stark contrast to Nazi treatment of Allied prisoners and Soviet POWs, millions of whom died in German camps. But for the women who experienced it, the motivations mattered less than the reality. They had been shown something they couldn't unsee, that even in war, humanity was possible, that rules could be followed, that enemies could be treated with dignity. The German women POWs became a footnote in history. Their numbers were small compared to male prisoners. Their stories lacked the drama of combat or the horror of concentration camps. But their experience revealed something profound about the nature of ideological warfare. The most effective weapon against Nazi ideology wasn't bombs or speeches. It was soap, food, medicine, the mundane enforcement of human rights. These things accomplished what propaganda never could. They forced a confrontation with reality. Anna kept her diary hidden for decades. When she finally shared it with her granddaughter in the 1980s, the young woman was stunned. "You never told us this." "No one wanted to hear it," Anna replied. "Germany wanted heroes or victims. We were neither. We were just women who learned that the world was not what we'd been taught." The final entry in her diary, written on her last night in the American camp before repatriation, captured the transformation. "Tomorrow I return to Germany. I do not know what I will find there. I do not know who I am anymore. I was raised to believe certain things about the world, about enemies, about Germany's destiny. All of it is ash now. The Americans gave me soap and bread and dignity when I expected only hatred. They followed rules when rules might have been abandoned. They showed me that humanity can persist even in war. I don't know if this makes them good or us evil. I don't know how to reconcile what I've seen with what I believed. But I know this. I will never be certain again. And perhaps that uncertainty, that doubt, that willingness to question, perhaps that is the real gift they gave me. Not the soap or the food, but the knowledge that I had been lied to, that I must think for myself, that easy certainties lead to terrible places. The women who returned from American captivity carried that burden forward. They rebuilt lives in a new Germany, democratic and divided. Some married American soldiers and immigrated back across the Atlantic through the War Brides Act. Others stayed, raised families, worked jobs, and never spoke of those months when the enemy fed them better than their own nation had. But the experience changed them. In a Germany desperate to forget, they remembered. And in remembering, they carried forward a small, powerful truth, that even in history's darkest chapters, individuals can choose humanity over ideology, that even enemies can recognize each other's dignity, that soap and bread offered without cruelty can shatter certainty more effectively than any weapon. The story of German women POWs in American captivity is not about heroes or villains. It's about the complex reality that exists between propaganda's absolutes. It's about young women who believed lies, served evil, suffered consequences, and encountered unexpected grace. Their story matters not because it was unique, but because it was human. And in the end, that was the revelation that changed everything. The recognition that humanity persists, even in war. That the enemy too is human. That dignity once shown cannot be unseen. The soap, white and fragrant and heavy in the hand, symbolized all of this. A simple thing, but revolutionary. Because it proved that another world was possible, one where even enemies could be treated with respect, one where rules mattered, one where humanity transcended hatred. For the women who experienced it, that knowledge was both burden and gift. They could never again believe simple certainties. But they had seen, with their own eyes, that there was an alternative to the cruelty and lies of the Reich. In the ruins of Germany, amid hunger and grief and shame, that knowledge was a seed, small, fragile, but alive. And from such seeds, new worlds grow.